A sadist, a serial killer, or a dark entity punishing sinners? Who really was the mysterious chocolatier, Willy Wonka? And what really happened to those guests of the factory who were unlucky enough to break the rules set by the owner? Did they really survive? Behind the incredible chocolate factory, the dream of every child, and Wonka's mysterious smile lies a truth that is much scarier and more terrifying than it would be worth putting into a children's fairy tale. Even without trying to dig deeper, this story is quite frightening. But we'll still risk opening the curtain that covers the dark secrets of this story and invite you to go on this journey with us. Roald Dahl's book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, published in 1964, inspired the cult films of their eras, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory in 1971, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, filmed in 2005 by Tim Burton with Johnny Depp in the lead role. Today, we'll look at the book, and in some places, at Tim Burton's film adaptation because it almost completely corresponds to the book content. This story is on the short list of the most popular children's books, but is it really that childish? Frankly, no, and a categorical no right down to the goosebumps. Because some episodes make you think and terrify you with the realization of what's behind the bright picture. That's why Burton wanted to make this film adaptation so much, because it fits his style and vision perfectly. A dark, mysterious, frightening reality behind a bright and attractive facade. But let's start from the very beginning. In a very poor family lived a boy named Charlie Bucket. And as is customary in instructive fairy tales, the boy was poor but very decent. He adored his family and did not complain about life, even though they all lived in poverty. Charlie's great passion, which he could not give up, was chocolate. Every day on his way to school, the boy passed by the shop windows and drooled, looking at the mountains of chocolate bars and sweets. But due to his family's meager fortune, he only received one bar of chocolate once a year on his birthday. Their house looked like it was about to fall apart. Poverty, sleeping on the floor, hunger. A child who stretches a chocolate bar for a month and sees it once a year. Agree, this is not the most cheerful beginning for a bright and joyful story. And it couldn't be any other because Roald Dahl grew up on Scandinavian folklore in which there are almost no bright and joyful stories. In a country where the dark polar night lasts for several months, any fairy tale is instructive and does not always end happily. Everyone gets what they deserve, and the strict Scandinavian gods do not tolerate weakness. Willy Wonka, by the way, is sometimes compared to the northern trickster god Loki. Why? Because like Loki, Wonka loved theatrics, enjoyed the deadly quest he arranged, and did not care that he did evil at the same time as good. Both are the perfect blend of cunning and charm, which makes them unsurpassed agents of chaos. Both have supernatural abilities, and if Wonka is not a god, then he's something very close to it. But let's get back to our Charlie. His poor life was in stark contrast to the huge chocolate factory called Wonka, located right next to his house. Charlie Bucket breathed in the aroma of chocolate every day and dreamed of getting inside. The factory was owned by the world's greatest candy inventor, the mysterious Mr. Willy Wonka, who had not been seen for a decade. Surrounded by a high wall with a huge gate that never opened, the factory hummed, smoked, and showed that there was active work going on there. But no one knew who worked there, because 10 years ago, Wonka had fired all the workers and closed the gate tightly. But why did the fantastic chocolatier suddenly close the factory and put so many workers on the street? The fact is that he was overcome with severe paranoia. Envious of the success of Wonka's creations, other confectioners began to send their spies to the Wonka factory. They stole recipes and produced the treats that Willy had invented, thereby almost bringing him to bankruptcy. What would a normal, adequate businessman do in such a case? He would probably introduce strict control, limit access to the recipe. But here, one of Willy Wonka's many bumblebees appeared: infantilism. He decided to avoid the problem in a radical way, just to avoid taking responsibility for the situation. He isolated himself from the world because from now on he distrusted all people, without exception, and decided to build his own comfortable world model. How did he do it? Unlike ordinary businessmen, he had his own means for this. because he had extraordinary abilities and easily arranged everything for himself. Grandpa Joe told Charlie about how he once worked in Mr. Wonka's factory and how fantastic and extraordinary its owner was. In Burton's film, this moment is especially noticeable because when we see Wonka in Grandpa's memories and then in the present day, he's not changed at all over the years. He might be aging, but not as quickly as ordinary people. From Grandpa, Charlie learns about other extraordinary abilities of the mysterious chocolatier. It turns out that he managed to create such sweets that, according to all the laws of science and logic, would be unreal. So even before we manage to look into the mysterious factory, we understand that not everything is so simple, both with the factory itself and with its owner. And then one day, something extraordinary happens. Willy Wonka arranges a raffle for 5 golden tickets. Those who get them will be able to visit the factory, and after the tour, each of the 5 will receive a lifetime supply of chocolate. In addition, one of them will be awarded a special prize. The tickets were hidden under the wrapper of chocolates which Wonka sent to different parts of the world. The first golden ticket was found by a very fat and gluttonous 9-year-old boy named Augustus Gloop, and with his victory, the chocolate fever gained even greater momentum. With his campaign, Wonka awakened the worst traits in many people. Someone robbed a bank and spent all the money on chocolates, while someone forged the coveted tickets. A kind of decency test on a global scale. Did Wonka foresee these consequences when he started this? It's likely that he did, because his subsequent actions would also encourage people to show their dark side in an unconventional situation. Soon, the name of the next winner became known. It was a girl named Veruca Salt, the only and incredibly spoiled daughter of a very wealthy family who was used to getting everything she wanted from her parents. The third winner was the arrogant and stubborn Violet Beauregard, a girl who set the world record for chewing gum and constantly bragged about it. The fourth was Mike TV, an angry boy who watched TV all day, lying on the couch, and was most fond of action movies. The last ticket remained. When Charlie's birthday came and he received the long-awaited chocolate bar, the dreamed golden ticket was not there. The next day, Grandpa Joe quietly gave his grandson a coin, all his saved money, and ordered him to buy another bar. But there was no ticket in that chocolate bar either. A few days later, as Charlie, barely able to move his legs from hunger, was hobbled to school, a miracle happened. In a ditch, he saw a $1 bill with which he ran to the store and bought a chocolate bar. Under the wrapper, oh, a miracle, was the golden ticket. It indicated the day and time when the boy had to be at the factory gate and that he was allowed to bring 1 or 2 relatives with him. Charlie was accompanied by Grandpa Joe. 9 adults and 5 children. What will happen to them in this mysterious factory? At the appointed time, the gates open and Willy Wonka appears, dressed in luxurious, extravagant clothes and with a golden cane in his hand. By the way, if we're talking about extravagance and we've already mentioned his paranoia, then we should not ignore the mental disorder that specialists diagnose him with. Both the book character and especially Willy Wonka, incredibly successfully embodied on the screen by Johnny Depp, definitely suffered from schizotypal personality disorder. He demonstrates several striking features that coincide with this personality disorder: excessive eccentricity, social isolation, and his magical and fantastic thinking. Maybe it was the potential mental illness that progressed and forced Wonka to start looking for a replacement. Well, let's return to the scene of Willy Wonka's appearance. Unlike Dahl, Burton portrayed Wonka's appearance in a more pathos and macabre, sinister way. In the film, guests are greeted by an ensemble of crepe puppets that move and sing a song about Willy Wonka. During the singing, the entire puppet troupe lights up, the plastic faces melt and distort, and the song continues to play. A very successful creepy prelude which metaphorically described what would happen to most children in the future. Inside, it turns out that the factory is infinitely large because it's located both on the surface and underground. According to Wonka, all its corridors go down, deep underground, and his possessions have no limits if you dive deeper and deeper. Whose possessions in most cultures are underground and have no boundaries there? What kind of place is this? Can you guess? And your guesses are probably right, but we'll dwell on this in more detail a little later. In the meantime, us, together with the winners and their parents, end up in the chocolate factory, which becomes a sentence for the greedy Augustus Gloop. The workshop was like a fairy tale valley with green meadows, flowers, trees, and a chocolate river flowing in the middle. Everything there was edible. And while the rest of the guests stood stunned by the wonders they saw, the fat guy Augustus secretly made his way to the river and began to sip chocolate straight from there. Wonka was worried that he would contaminate the chocolate, but the boy did not hear anything until he fell into the river, losing his balance. There, the scared fat guy was sucked into one of the huge glass pipes that sucked the chocolate out of the river and transported it through the factory, and through the glass, you could see how the terrified Augustus was rapidly moving down the pipe into the unknown. Here's the first victim, a boy who was punished for his incredible greed and gluttony. How did Mr. Wonka react to this terrible accident? The chocolatier was not at all concerned. He reassured others that the pipe led to the chocolate-covered fudge shop and that nothing would happen to him there. He was more concerned that if the boy stayed in the chocolate mixer too long, the fudge would become inedible. In the same workshop, the guests saw another miracle. Tiny creatures dressed in savage clothes. Wonka explained that these were Oompa Loompas, a tribe from distant lands which he, attention, brought here by smuggling in cargo containers. Then it becomes even better. According to him, at home in the jungle, the Oompa Loompas live in primitive conditions, eating whatever they could find, and their greatest dream was to eat cocoa beans, which they adored, at least from time to time. What did the oh-so-good Mr. Wonka do? He offered them to move to his factory and work there around the clock, receiving payment only in cocoa beans. That is, brought into the country in the same way that slaves were transported in ancient times. In cramped, dark containers, this tribe of little men actually became slaves of the chocolate magnate. They were isolated from the rest of the world in his factory and did not receive even a penny of real money. In addition, Willy Wonka enthusiastically told his guests that he tested all his new inventions on Oompa Loompas. This is despite the fact that many of these tests ended in failure and his employees suffered at least physical injuries. There's no doubt that there were many fatalities. But for some reason, the tribe obediently carried out all the orders of their master and, moreover, fully supported his sinister plan regarding the naive guests, who had no idea what awaited them. Probably he kept them with something else besides cocoa beans. Maybe fear? Or maybe the story was only partly true and Willy Wonka specifically went to the jungle for this wild tribe because their moral principles and inclination not only to chocolate but also to sadism completely correspond to his own. Because behind this raffle and what happened to the first winner, there was some dark plan, and it was prepared in advance. Where does such confidence come from? Because at the very moment when Gloop's parents were taken out of the hall to look for the missing child, the Oompa Loompas choir sang a creepy song that mocked Augustus's greed and emphasized that he deserved what happened to him. In the original book, unlike the Tim Burton film, this song is long, well-rhymed, and very cruel. How could the Oompa Loompas compose this text in just a few minutes, learn it coherently, and also set it to a melody? Only if they knew in advance that this was going to happen, and that it was going to happen to Augustus. By the way, in both the printed version and the films based on the book, at the end of the adventure, all the children leave the factory alive, but not everything is so rosy. In fact, in the original manuscript, which the publishers forced the author to rework and remove many chapters that did not fit the children's story at all, everything was much darker. In the book, the Oompa Loompas' song about Gloop makes it clear that he won't survive. That is, he won't survive in the form he was in before. They sang that he would be cut with hundreds of knives, then boiled for a little while longer to make sure all greed would be boiled out of him forever. Is it possible to survive such a procedure? Of course not. Of course, Wonka immediately began to convince that the song was just a joke, but would he have told the truth? 5 children and 9 adults became voluntary hostages of this sweet-voiced maniac. But was the mysterious chocolatier exactly the serial killer, as some versions claim? No. In fact, everything was much darker and more terrifying. When Augustus and his parents had disappeared, a giant boat appeared, rowed by Oompa Loompas, and Wonka, with the remaining guests, swam down the chocolate river following the current, which was getting faster and faster. The river narrowed, it got darker, and the boat was carried into a black tunnel through which the river roared and flowed somewhere deep and down. There was a dark kingdom deep underground accessible only by boat, sailing along a dark river. The river Styx, the kingdom of the dead and its lord, who receives and punishes sinful souls. We promised that the truth would be scary, right? And that's exactly one of the main versions of the true nature of Willy Wonka and what his factory symbolizes. He not only accepted those who succumbed to some sin, it was he who tempted people to manifest this sin and made them pay for it. But let's see if this theory will be confirmed. The guests were quite frightened, and the horror had already reached its peak when the boat finally sailed into the lighted area and sailed on, passing many doors. At the door marked Inventing Room, the boat stopped and Wonka invited everyone inside. This huge hall was the favorite room of the factory owner. It was there that all the new sweets were developed and tested on the Oompa Loompas. Wonka warned the guests not to eat anything, but Violet Beauregard, seeing the experimental lunch gum, grabbed it and began to chew it furiously. The gum was designed to feed the person who chewed it a full 3-course meal. Violet commented on the taste of each course, which followed one after the other, but when it came to dessert, blueberry pie, the punishment caught up with her too. The girl turned blue and began to bloat until she looked like a huge blueberry. Her parents were of course shocked, and the Oompa Loompas moved her to another room where they tried to squeeze blueberry juice out of her. At the very moment when Violet turned into a blueberry girl, the singing Oompa Loompas appeared again and sang a new song, this time about her, and at the end of the song, as in the case of Augustus, there were eerie and dubious lines. This time about trying to save the girl from a cruel fate if, of course, she remained alive after the treatment, which they were not all sure about. Now that we have two similar examples of terrible accidents involving winners, it's time to talk in more detail about the chocolatier himself and what actually happened there. We've already said that Willy Wonka is not a maniac and that a factory tour at some point becomes strangely similar to a trip to the afterlife. So who is he really? The charming and cruel trickster Willy Wonka. In Tim Burton's film, and this is the only way in which his film version differs significantly from the book, he gives Willy a backstory about his dentist father who forbade him from everything sweet as a child, and about the rebellion of a boy who dreamed of sweets above all else. Although this version explains to us where Willy Wonka's obsession with sweets came from, it steals from us the very essence of Wonka's personality, as described by Roald Dahl. Because in the book, there is not a single hint that Wonka was an ordinary person, that he had an ordinary childhood, a father, dreams, and disappointments, as well as where he came from in the first place. Who was he then? An entity? A fallen angel? A god of the underworld, after all? Someone whose purpose was to tempt people and punish them for their sins? Exactly, and no less. Despite his sweet facade, Wonka didn't even hide his indifference to what happened to the children. Because they deserved it. Because they sinned by breaking his commandments, and most importantly, they were the embodiments of the main deadly sins. Shocking, isn't it? But it's true. As we'll see later, the rest of the children were also embodiments of sins, and also received their punishment. By the way, it's no coincidence that in the very first version of the story, Dahl had 8 golden tickets, not 5. Because in the very first classification of sins, developed by a Byzantine theologian, there were exactly 8 deadly sins. That is 8 sinful children plus righteous Charlie. True, the writer excluded one sin, adultery, because these are still children, and the sins were distributed unevenly among them, sometimes repeating themselves. Since, as we've already mentioned, several chapters and characters were cut due to the incredible cruelty of what was happening there. Yes, in the original it's even harsher. As a result, only 5 children remained. In Augustus, it was gluttony and greed. In Violet, it was excessive pride and vanity. After all, in her first interview with journalists, her goal was to brag about her record of chewing gum to the whole world. In Veruca Salt, it was greed and envy. And in Mike TV, it was anger and laziness. It was because of his mystical nature that Wonka knew in advance what would happen to each of the bad children, and from him this information was going to the Oompa Loompas. That's why every time they had a song prepared in advance for each case. And remember that happy incident when Charlie found $1 with which he managed to buy a chocolate bar with a golden ticket? You think it was a coincidence? Hardly. This was also planned in advance, because despite all the sinful and spoiled children, Willy Wonka needed a righteous person who would also be tested, but who, in contrast, would have every chance of resisting temptation, and thereby deserve to become the successor to this strange kingdom. As an omniscient devil tempter, Wonka knows exactly how to manipulate children, what temptation to present to each of them. Setting traps for them, he pushes each to commit a sin, and accordingly to disappear, distort, and even to potential death. a fallen angel from heaven who founded his sweet underground kingdom in which he led visitors through all the circles of his paradise hell, weeding out sinners. That's why he possesses omniscience and omnipresence. His mission is to attract and seduce, awakening in people their worst traits. Here, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is often compared to Dante's Divine Comedy, with the main character going through all the circles of hell, watching sinners being punished. The fact that Willy Wonka found and led the unspoiled boy Charlie through the ordeal allowed him, albeit briefly, to ascend back to heaven. In the last chapter of the book, when Charlie wins, he, Willy, and Grandpa Joe fly into the light, straight into the sky, breaking through the roof of the factory, but that'll be at the end. Let's get back to the story. Next on the tour was the nut sorting room, which became Veruca Salt's sentence. Her sin was greed and envy, because she wanted to have everything interesting that she saw in others. Incredibly spoiled by her parents, the girl got used to getting everything. Seeing real squirrels shelling nuts for Wonka's treats, she immediately threw a tantrum that she wanted one for herself and ran to catch a fluffy animal. The next scene is like a nightmare from Hitchcock's The Birds, only with squirrels, because all the animals in the workshop pounced on Veruca and threw her into the garbage chute, where spoiled nuts were thrown, because she really was spoiled. The garbage chute into which Salt's parents fell after their daughter led to the incinerator. And of course, here the Oompa Loompas again sang a song about the capricious Veruca Salt, who fell into the garbage, and the parents who constantly indulged or spoiled the girl, and that if they were lucky, the oven might not work that day. By the way, this theme is also key in the plan of punishments embodied by Wonka, because it's the parents who indulge the children's spoilness and sometimes are an example for them. That's why not only the children suffer in the creepy factory, but also their parents. But let's get back to the factory tour. Now there's only 2 children left, Charlie and Mike TV. At Wonka's invitation, they all enter the glass elevator, an aircraft that serves as the tycoon's means of transportation around the factory. If we recall the movie, Tim Burton included in the script one, not very noticeable at first glance, confirmation that Wonka knew in advance that each stage of the excursion, the sinful children would disappear their parents. This part isn't in the book. The boat in which they traveled on the Chocolate River had enough space only for those guests who were left at that time, without the Gloops. In the scene with the elevator, there was room only for those who survived at that time. In the elevator, they rushed through various amazing rooms of the factory and eventually got to the place where Wonka's latest invention was being tested, television chocolate. The chocolatier developed a way to transmit chocolate over a distance similar to how television signals are transmitted. But everything Wonka placed under the beam of the device shrank significantly during the transmission process. Before anyone could even blink, Mike TV rushed under the beam, furious that Willy Wonka had not yet tried to transmit a person over a distance in this way. He did move and ended up not on the TV screen but in another room, but he shrank tenfold so that he could fit in the palm of his hand. Wonka suggested sending him to a chewing gum stretching room to have him stretched to normal size. Looks like medieval torture, but whatever. Here the Oompa Loompas sang their creepy song again, and of course they doubted that the boy's stretching would end very well. So what we have here is Mike's sins were laziness and anger for which he paid the price. At this point, the supply of naughty and sinful children runs out, and only the polite and clever Charlie Bucket and Grandpa Joe remain. At the very end, we learn another reason why Wonka put on this whole fascinating but creepy and cruel show. He started this surreal nightmare in which children are removed from the group one by one, and it's not completely known what will happen to them, whether it's irreversible disfigurement or a painful death, in order to choose an heir. The truth is that he'd chosen Charlie in advance. He'd been watching him. Wonka had arranged for Charlie to buy that chocolate bar so he would join a sadistic quest and pass all the tests. And now, at the end of the journey, Willy Wonka had pressed the button that said, "Up and away," and the elevator had flown into the sky. Charlie's innocence had given Wonka not only a worthy heir, but also the wings he had once lost. But what is the only reason he had chosen Charlie? Maybe the reason was that unlike the other winners who, despite all their sinfulness, had character, Charlie was more like a person who could easily be influenced by others. Wonka could potentially mold him into anything, in his own image and likeness. Maybe that's why in Burton's film, unlike the book, Wonka at first categorically refused Charlie when he wanted to move his entire family to live in the factory he was to inherit. so that they could not interfere with his ability to raise the boy in his own way. And yet, why then did the chocolatier test the boy with the others? Why all this? He could have just invited him alone. Here again, a bit of terrible truth. Wonka did it so Charlie could see what could happen to naughty children and what tortures could await them. A kind of lever of psychological influence so that the boy would not only admire Willy Wonka, but also be afraid of him. Do you think that these are all the terrible possibilities that lie behind this story? At the end of the tale, when Charlie, Grandpa, and Wonka watch the other guests leave the factory, they see with their own eyes that they are all alive, although not entirely whole. This is mentioned in both the book and the film. But was this picture true? We've already seen Willy Wonka's supernatural abilities, and the ability to create illusions is one of the traits of this tempter, so it's very possible that the entire peaceful scene was just a visual illusion created by him to calm Charlie down. Well, are you already scared enough by this chocolate children's tale? The truth is that in every fairy tale, myth, or legend, there is a facade with a neatly trimmed lawn and clean windows, and there's a backyard which is sometimes overgrown with impenetrable thickets, full of strange sounds, bizarre shadows, ancient and creepy secrets. Stay with us, subscribe to this channel, and together we will continue to look into the secret dark corners of famous and familiar stories from our childhood.